Hey guys, tonight we slip into a world of swirling fog, brass buttons, and brisk walks through parks where no one's in a rush because they're all too busy staring up. That's right. Tonight we're heading back to the 1800s, a time when the sky wasn't just a background, it was a battleground. A place where gentlemen with immaculate sideburns and truly unnecessary cravats argued politely but passionately about clouds. Fluffy ones, flat ones, ones that looked like ships or sheep or the Queen's new hat. You walk the gravel path of Hyde Park in 1803, coat buttoned to the chin, the air laced with coal smoke and the metallic edge of early industry. Above you, a sky in chaos, masses of vapor shifting like stage curtains. And beside you, a man with a leather-bound notebook scribbling wildly every time a cloud changes shape. You've just stumbled into one of the strangest scientific quarrels of the Victorian age. And trust me, some of you won't survive this. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You begin with the sky. That's how many great arguments begin, actually looking up, seeing something beautiful and deciding, this definitely needs a Latin name. In early 19th century England, the sky wasn't just a poetic playground. It was a question. What were clouds made of? Why did they change? And could anyone make sense of their dance? The popular answer, no. The clouds were too fickle, too romantic, too floofy, unmeasurable. You might as well try to categorize dreams. But then came people, very serious people, who thought, what if we did exactly that? You find yourself watching Londoners walk in patterns umbrellas, tucked neatly under arms, as fog curls around chimney stacks. It's an era obsessed with order. Phrenology maps the bumps of the skull. Linnaean taxonomy carves the world's flora and fauna into bite-sized boxes. And the clouds still defiantly unclassified. Until someone decides that will not do. That someone isn't a duke or a lord, or even particularly famous. He's a chemist, and not the fun blow-up-your-basement kind. The quiet ink-smudged, I'll just stand here and watch the weather for 20 years kind. But before we get to him, we need to understand why clouds even mattered to the Victorians. For one thing, weather was personal. No weather app, no Doppler radar. If you wanted to know what tomorrow might hold, you stared at the sky and hoped your knees didn't twinge in warning. And in an empire built on shipping lanes and train timetables, forecasting wasn't just idle curiosity, it was economic survival. Now picture a tea room. Gilded edges, velvet chairs, maybe a faint smell of nutmeg and candle wax. Inside, two scholars with long mustaches are arguing over whether a particular cloud seen in Dorset was stratus or something else entirely. They're sketching diagrams on napkins, quoting Greek, occasionally accusing each other of observational bias. One of them pulls out a pocket telescope. The other, a monograph. The waitress doesn't blink. This was not unusual. By 1800, the Royal Society was already knee-deep in weather notes. Amateurs sent letters. Professors debated. One newspaper even published a weekly Skywatchers report describing clouds with phrases like whale-tail cumuli or storm mares in bloom. It got weirder. There was a brief, deeply confusing moment in the 1790s when people thought clouds were formed by moonbeams reacting to volcanic dust. Thank you, Krakatoa. And another period when some believed cloud shape was influenced by music. Yes, actual symphonies changing the structure of water vapor. If that sounds bonkers, you're not wrong, but also not entirely alone. Historians still argue whether these fringe theories were satire or sincere. Some Victorian journals were eccentric, but what's not eccentric is your walk through the park tonight. You tilt your head. Watch a low gray slab roll across the rooftops like a wool blanket pulled tight. Then a fluffy tower, brilliant white, blooms beside it. It's beautiful, transient, and somehow someone once thought, I'm going to name that. You breathe in soot-laced air and drift toward a lamppost just flickering on. Because next, you're about to meet the man who did it. And no, he didn't have a lab coat, or a castle, or a title. Just a pen, a keen eye, and a very strong opinion about atmospheric vapor. His name is Luke Howard. You're probably not familiar, unless you're the sort of person who alphabetizes their weather apps or owns multiple barometers just in case. But back in 1802, Luke Howard did something astonishingly bold. He looked at the clouds and gave them names. Latin ones, obviously. Because in the language of science, nothing says I'm serious like a few good declensions. Luke wasn't a nobleman. He wasn't even a university professor. He was a Quaker chemist, a devoutly spiritual man who believed that understanding the sky might bring you closer to the divine. And while other people were writing poems about clouds or making watercolor sketches, Luke was out there with his notebook naming the heavens like he owned the patent. You imagine him now, top hat, slightly askew, ink-stained fingers, twitching with excitement as he unveils his classification system to the world. 3 primary shapes. Cumulus, those big friendly cotton balls. Stratus, flat gray blankets draped across the sky. Cirrus, thin wisps like angel hair, high and elegant. And then, just to make sure everyone knew this wasn't a hobby, he combined them into compound types. Cumulonimbus, stratocumulus, cirrostratus. You pause and say it aloud. Cirrostratus. It sounds like a Roman senator and a fluffy pancake had a baby. Howard's brilliance wasn't just in naming things, it was in creating a language. A way to read the sky that made sense. People didn't have to describe clouds like that long sausage one over the hill that might be a horse. They had structure now. A shared code, and oh how the Victorians loved codes. Almost immediately, Howard's system spread. It was adopted by the Royal Society. The German poet Goethe, yes, that. Goethe wrote an ode to him. Translations appeared in France, Germany, even Russia. The clouds' once poetic chaos were now filed neatly into drawers. You sit beneath a drifting cumulus, watching its edges melt like ice cream in slow motion, and think this man tamed the sky with syllables. But of course, not everyone was impressed. Enter the skeptics. Some natural philosophers argued that Howard's system was too simplistic, that clouds weren't static shapes. They shifted, morphed, evolved. Trying to pin them down, they said, was like photographing a sneeze. One eccentric Scottish weather enthusiast, because of course there was one, refused to use Howard's names and created his own cloud lexicon. It included such gems as sky eels, wind shrouds, and morning grumbles. Historians still argue whether he was genuinely serious or just had too much sherry and free time. Others worried that naming clouds might reduce their mystery, that by classifying them, you robbed them of poetry. But Luke Howard was no enemy of wonder. Quite the opposite. His notes are filled with awe descriptions of clouds glowing like golden embers at dusk, or spiraling into dragons above the Thames. He believed naming something didn't diminish its magic. It amplified it. He once wrote, "The sky is the daily bread of the eyes. You stare upward, you get it." Of course, there were still practical issues. How do you teach an entire empire to recognize cumulus from stratocumulus? Who gets to decide when a cloud becomes a different kind? Could cloud type predict a painter's weather, or was it merely decorative? So debates raged. Some argued that Howard's Latin terms should be replaced by English ones. Others wanted color added to the classification, perhaps, to distinguish threatening clouds from benign ones. One particularly dramatic fellow proposed musical notations to describe the movement of cloud cirrus in a G major arpeggio stratus as a low B-flat drone. No one took him seriously, but his illustrations were apparently beautiful. Meanwhile, Luke Howard just kept watching the sky, recording, sketching, occasionally publishing quiet little papers with bold titles like "On the Modifications of Clouds." And here's your quirky tidbit for the night: he didn't make money off this. He didn't want to. Cloud classification wasn't a career. It was a calling. Imagine doing something so profoundly useful that the entire world uses it and never asking for a penny. Imagine believing that naming clouds was just your duty. You follow the ghost of Luke Howard, now his coat trailing behind him, as he climbs a small London hill at sunrise, notebook in hand. He's scribbling something. You lean over his shoulder. Cumulus forming from morning fog, stratus thinning at the horizon. You can feel the quiet pride in every letter. And while historians still argue whether his work was truly revolutionary or just conveniently timed, you can't help but admire the man who gave the sky a voice. So you sit with that, under a cirrus veil, feeling the weight of clouds that finally have names, and the strange satisfaction of knowing that one humble chemist once looked up and refused to look away. You picture yourself now wandering a narrow, rain-darkened street in 19th century London, the kind where chimneys sigh into a gray sky, and the puddles are reflective enough to tell your future. Overhead, the clouds roil somewhere between cotton and charcoal. And you wonder what Luke Howard would have jotted down in his notebook right now. Stratocumulus. Maybe altostratus with a bit of bootiness. But tonight you're not alone under this particular sky, because Luke's quiet revolution inspired imitators, competitors, and full-blown fanatics. And one of the loudest voices in the cloud conversation, Ralph Abercrombie. No relation to the fashion brand, though. If someone had turned his cloud obsession into a clothing line, you'd probably buy it just for the jackets. Abercrombie wasn't just a theorist. He was a ischiki chaser, born into Scottish nobility, but not particularly interested in castles or kilts. He instead wandered the globe in the mid-1800s with a journal in one hand and a pocket thermometer in the other, trying to understand the weatherkimper through the lens of clouds. You picture him on a ship's deck scribbling furiously while the sky fractures overhead. He was, as the journals put it, a gentleman of curious conviction. Translation, wonderfully stubborn. Abercrombie's big idea that clouds could be standardized globally. A sort of meteorological Esperanto. It wasn't enough to name the clouds. He wanted to measure them, photograph them, even chart their altitudes. He teamed up with a Swedish meteorologist named Hugo Hildebrandsson, whose name alone sounds like thunderclouds, and together they began pushing for international cloud codification. And here's your mainstream historical fact. Their efforts led to the very first International Cloud Atlas in 1896, published by the World Meteorological Organization's predecessor. This book, it wasn't just a list. It was a manifesto, a sacred text for weather nerds. Pages upon pages of painted illustrations, descriptions, definitions, cumulus, stratus, cirrus, and their hybrids. Altocumulus, nimbostratus, cumulonimbus, the mighty thundercloud. It's all there in watercolors, so dreamy they'd make Bob Ross cry. It wasn't perfect, of course. Some entries were a bit vague. Others described clouds that no one had ever seen, except the guy who submitted the sketch, like fleecy inverted mammatus, or cirrus unsinus, trailing toward despair. Okay, I may have added the despair part, but the atlas gave us something we take for granted now, a shared sky. Now, you could be on a train in Bombay or a farm in Norway. Look up and write in your journal altostratus approaching from the west, and someone across the world would understand exactly what you meant. Clouds became language, and language is connection. But of course, not everyone wanted connection. Some Victorian scientists, particularly the ones with more beard than humility, hated the idea of pinning clouds down with such precision. One notorious dissenting voice was that of George Simons, a rainfall obsessive so intense he once cataloged precipitation by neighborhood block. Simons argued that clouds were too subjective, too varied, too personal to categorize. His journal entries are full of jabs like, "Why attempt to label the infinite?" And altostratus today bore no resemblance to altostratus yesterday. What nonsense. You can imagine him yelling at a cloud like it owed him money. Meanwhile, Abercrombie was out there risking seasickness and sunstroke just to sketch clouds in Australia, Brazil, and the Alps. And here's your quirky tidbit for the night. Abercrombie once convinced sailors to describe cloud formations in nautical poetry. Not for science, just for fun. The result? weather reports like the sky wore petticoats of thunder and fog stitched its hem to the mast. Historians still argue whether these lyrical submissions were genuine field notes or just the result of long nights at sea with nothing but rum and boredom. Either way, you kind of love it. But back to the atlas. With its arrival came classification charts in schools, instructional diagrams for farmers, and hand-painted guides in the hands of anyone who dared look up and guess. Suddenly, weather predictions started sounding almost reliable, sort of, because even with all these names and drawings, clouds remained mercurial. They changed shape, flirted with category lines, played dress-up across hemispheres, and trying to pin them down scientifically was like trying to teach a cat to file its taxes. Still, people tried. There were debates about altitude thresholds. How high must a cumulus climb before it becomes cumulonimbus? What's the difference between cirrostratus and altostratus if your eyes are tired? And then, as if to troll everyone involved, a new type appeared. Lenticular clouds, shaped like flying saucers, hovering silently over mountains like UFOs made of whipped cream. Some called them portents. Others thought they were omens. One weather observer insisted they were the size of the Earth itself. That guy never got published again. But in the International Cloud Atlas, lenticular clouds were lovingly added. Alongside mammatus clouds, those strange pouch-like formations that look like the sky is growing udders. Yes, that's real. And so with each passing year, the Victorian obsession with clouds grew. Not because they needed to predict the rain, but because they wanted to understand beauty, to make poetry out of pattern. You look up now and feel it the same thing Howard must have felt, or Abercrombie, or any of the sky watchers who scribbled strange Latin names while the wind whipped their faces. This wasn't just science. This was devotion. This was watching the sky and whispering, "I see you," and the sky, in all its shape-shifting arrogance, whispering back, "Name me if you dare." You're still looking up eyes, chasing the last soft curl of a cirrus cloud, disappearing like it's late to a Victorian dinner party. And in that moment, you begin to feel just how deep this obsession went. How a sky full of ephemeral fluff triggered debates sharp enough to ruin friendships, reputations, and maybe a dinner party or two. Because tonight, we move into the part of the story where naming clouds became not just a matter of science, but of ego. Imagine this. It's the late 1800s, and meteorological societies are cropping up like mushrooms after rain. Everyone who's anyone has a barometer in their parlor and a window seat dedicated to sky watching. Cloud spotting becomes not just a hobby, but a status symbol. You're not just admiring the sky anymore, you're interpreting it, not classifying it, arguing over Latin suffixes. Like your social standing depends on it, which in some cases it weirdly does. Here's your mainstream historical fact. By the 1870s, weather stations across Europe had begun sending daily sky reports, coded with standardized cloud terms. What started with Luke Howard's handwritten notes was now a global system monitored by telegraph. That's right. Cloud gossip went viral at the speed of copper wire. But as with any club, some members get intense. One of the most notorious debates, whether cirrocumulus was a legitimate standalone cloud or merely a transitional phase between cirrus and cumulus. Now you might think, who cares? But to Victorian meteorologists, this was like debating the existence of Pluto. Decades before Pluto had the chance to get demoted, it got heated. You had Team Cumulus arguing that the poofy shape of cirrocumulus disqualified it from the high-altitude club. Meanwhile, Team Cirrus countered that any cloud that wispy had to belong upstairs. Diagrams were published, open letters were written, lectures were interrupted, and somewhere a man in a tweed waistcoat probably yelled, "You cloud snob," in a packed London lecture hall. Amid this chaos, new voices emerged. One of them was Eleanor Ormerod, a formidable woman and an expert on agricultural pests who dabbled in weather reporting and whose Cloud Diaries became unexpectedly popular. Her entries weren't just observational. They were philosophical. She once described cumulonimbus clouds as God's anvil in the sky, which, let's be honest, is a line that deserves to be tattooed across a weather vane. Eleanor wasn't alone. There were amateur cloud sketchers. Across Europe, retired naval officers, widowed duchesses, bored teenagers, sending watercolor renderings of sky compositions to local journals. Some were breathtaking. Others looked like damp wallpaper. But the intention was clear. The sky had become a canvas, and everyone wanted to paint. Here's your quirky tidbit for this section. Queen Victoria herself kept a weather diary. Every morning, her chambermaid would note down temperature, cloud type, and general mood. She apparently preferred overcast skies, calling them soothing to the constitution. One entry simply reads, "Cirrostratus at breakfast." Excellent. Historians still argue whether she actually cared about the science or just used it as a polite way to avoid conversation during early meals. But no matter how lofty or humble the observer there was, now a collective consciousness, a shared agreement that clouds meant something. They weren't just fluff. They were indicators of storms, of moods, of national character. A French naturalist once wrote that the English temperament was stratus at T cumulus at war. That line got him kicked out of a dinner party, but it stuck. And here's the surprising twist. Cloud classification wasn't just about weather. It started sneaking into poetry, fashion, even politics. There were caricatures in newspapers depicting parliament debates as nimbostratus rolling in from the left. Fashion writers used cirrus-style collars to describe airy lace designs. Philosophers argued that the cloud's refusal to be pinned down was a metaphor for the elusive self. Because when you try to name something as untouchable as vapor, you're not just organizing it, you're wrestling with mystery. And Victorians, they loved wrestling with mystery, especially if it involved footnotes. By the 1890s, with the International Cloud Atlas in full circulation, a new breed of cloud lover appeared, the weather purist. These were folks who insisted on strict adherence to the Atlas categories, no hybrids, no romantic descriptions, just the facts. They hosted cloud spotting events with scorecards. You got points for accurate classification, points deducted for poetic rambling. Someone once got disqualified for describing a cloud as smoldering like guilt. Honestly, justice for that guy. But this clash between the romantics of beer and the scientifics of dirt would define the next chapter of cloud theory. And it wasn't just a stylistic debate, it was existential. Was the sky a laboratory or a cathedral? Was a cloud a humble data point or a universe? You think about this now as you walk through a misty park. Victorian fog curling around your ankles like a particularly moody scarf. You imagine these debates happening in smoky drawing rooms over tea and tobacco, with someone slamming their teacup down and declaring, "Sir, that was not altostratus. It was clearly a poorly formed altocumulus." And across the table, someone else going, "I'll altostratus you if you don't calm down." It's absurd, and it's beautiful, because it proves one thing. Humans, when given something fleeting and unknowable, will always try to give it a name, a frame, a function. We stare up, we scribble, we argue. Not because clouds need again us, but because we need on them, to remind us that not everything that matters has to stay still, that not every argument needs a resolution, that sometimes the sky is just the sky. And that's enough. So now you're walking with your hands tucked into your coat, a soft drizzle tapping your shoulders, and you can't stop picturing Victorian gentlemen pacing their parlors, trying to resolve the cumulus paradox, or whatever existential fog they'd conjured into academic combat. And it's in this quiet stroll, just you and the weather, that you begin to sense a shift in the cloud world. Because around the turn of the 20th century, something big happens. Clouds stop being a curiosity. They start becoming a tool. Meteorology, once the hobby of clergy aristocrats and lighthouse keepers, becomes a science of survival, not just to know whether to carry an umbrella, but to predict storms, track pressure systems, and eventually plan wars. Yes, wars. But we'll get to that. First, the mainstream historical fact of the section. In 1896, the RICA International Meteorological Committee publishes the first International Cloud Atlas, a beautifully illustrated multilingual masterpiece that standardizes cloud types and their descriptions for the entire world. Think of it as the Pokemon guidebook for sky watchers, only with more Latin and fewer fireballs. This was a big deal, because suddenly a cloud wasn't just what Sheet called it. It had a name, a category, an altitude, a sketch reference, an assigned personality, and just like that, weather becomes calc data. There's a part of you that wants to cheer for this, and you do quietly because it means progress, communication, and clarity. But also, a little part of you mourns because the whimsical metaphors, the smoldering guilt clouds, they don't get chapters in the atlas, only measurements. Here's the quirky tidbit for this part. The Cloud Atlas included photographic plates, making it one of the first government-backed science books to use photography as evidence, not just illustration. The images were moody, grainy, and hauntingly beautiful. One reviewer at the time called it the first book to make fog feel like a philosophy, which, let's be honest, is a review we all secretly want. But even with this slick new system in place, people still argued. The new fights, not about sure what a cloud was, but about what it meant. Enter the era of anti-military meteorology. By the early 1900s, governments start realizing that if you can track clouds, you can predict troop movements, guide zeppelins, and avoid muddy battlefields. Weather becomes a tactical weapon. And suddenly the cloud debates don't sound so silly anymore, because a storm isn't just romantic, it's strategic. Wummer. A cumulus over Belgium might mean a delayed advance, a low nimbus stratus near the Alps, maybe a postponed air raid. Historians still argue whether cloud literacy actually changed the outcomes of early 20th century conflicts, or if generals just liked pretending they were sky whisperers. But it's undeniable that clouds became something you could use, a resource, not just a muse. And that shift echoed down into culture. The poets noticed, the painters noticed, even the philosophers took note. Because the sky, the great ever-changing canvas, was no longer just a metaphor for divine moods. It was under surveillance. Even school children were taught to memorize cloud types, tiny human barometers in training. One popular French textbook from 1912 featured hand-colored illustrations of cloud types, labeled with charming, slightly terrifying reminders like "Cirrus spring change," "Watch for your hat." You imagine being 9 years old staring at a swirl of watercolor fluff and muttering, "Ah yes, altocumulus, stratiformis translucidus," while desperately hoping you still get recess. And it worked. Cloud awareness spread. People who'd never read a single scientific paper were now spotting lenticular clouds from their cottage windows and proudly exclaiming things like, "There's a rotor cloud today, better not air out the laundry." But not everyone was pleased. There were still those who missed the uncertainty, who missed the unnameable, who missed the feeling of looking up and not knowing, of being comforted by the sky's refusal to explain itself. One of them was Marcel Minnaert, a Dutch astronomer and naturalist who wrote what is arguably the loveliest weather book ever penned, The Nature of Light and Color in the Open Air. In it, he doesn't just explain clouds, he watches in them, he listens, and he writes lines like, "There is no color so quietly haunting as the violet shadow of a cumulus over open fields." You let that line sit with you, because it reminds you that science can still be poetic, even when it measures, even when it predicts. The cloud doesn't become less beautiful because you understand it. It just becomes more complicated. And as you walk now beneath a sky that's turned from pewter to rose to indigo in the space of a few quiet breaths, you begin to think maybe this whole cloud argument This centuries-long debate between artists and scientists was never about the clouds at all. Maybe it was about what we do when we face something bigger than us. Do we name it? Do we measure it? Do we write poems about it? Yes, all of the above. Because we are human, and that's what we do. We look up, we feel something, and then we try to make that feeling last. Even if it's just in a sketchbook, even if it's just in a classroom chalk diagram, even if it's just whispered quietly into the steam of your tea as you say, "Looks like cirrostratus again." You pause under a tree, one of those bare winter-sculpted ones that feels like a lightning bolt frozen midair. You look up through its branches at the clouds, not too many tonight, just enough, and you whisper not to the sky, but to yourself. You've been named, but you're still mysterious. And that feels good. That feels right. Because in the end, classification isn't captivity. It's just our way of saying, I saw you. I noticed. I tried. And maybe that's all the clouds ever needed. The sky has gone full velvet now. Indigo fading to soot. One last smear of silver near the horizon. And your breath puffs little clouds of its own. Which feels fitting, doesn't it? You adding your own microfog to the night. Tiny weather systems exhaled into history. You keep walking, because this story isn't done yet. Tonight you've moved from the polite salons of Victorian argument to the cloud-obsessed chalkboards of early 20th century meteorology. But now we enter stranger territory, because this is the chapter where clouds get weird again. Yes, that's right. They were named. They were mapped. They were given altitudes and types and useful roles in battlefield logistics. And still they refused to behave. Here's your mainstream historical fact in 1943. RAF pilot, Lieutenant John Baldwin, encountered a cloud formation so unusual during a mission over the North Sea that it made it into the official weather log as anomalous vertical convection spiral luminous at apex. Sounds a little dramatic, sure, but that's because we were entering the era of cloud anomalies, the edge of known classification, where the sky starts doing things that don't fit into neat Latin bins. Which brings us to tonight's quirky detour, fall streak holes, giant circular gaps that appear in altocumulus clouds like the sky forgot a piece, sometimes mistaken for UFO portals, sometimes just an overachieving bit of ice crystal physics. You've probably seen photos of one, or a dozen depending on your algorithm. But in the 1940s and 1950s, these caused panic. Farmers wrote letters to their governments. Children cried during recess. Dogs howled, probably for unrelated reasons. But it all added to the mood. Historians still argue whether this surge of cloud anomalies was just better observation technology, or if the sky really was shifting in reaction to a world gone fully modern. Jets were slicing through stratospheres. Nuclear tests were altering pressure systems. Smokestacks were painting new colors into sunsets. And clouds? Well, clouds started getting expressive. Some meteorologists began documenting formations that didn't match any known category. They invented placeholder names like undulatus asperatus, a term that sounds like a Harry Potter spell, but just means agitated waves. You picture a bunch of British scientists in wool coats standing in a field shouting undulatus asperatus at the sky like it owes them money. But honestly, that name fits. Because these clouds, they look like the ocean has been flipped upside down. Ridges, ripples, ropes of vapor twisting like muscles in a slow-motion punch. You stand now on a hilltop somewhere quiet, timeless, and you look up. And maybe, just maybe, you see something like it. The sky folded in uneasy curves. Not angry, not peaceful, just uncertain. And you feel that uncertainty echo in your chest. Because clouds, it turns out, are very good at reflecting mood. And not just the mood. Your mood. Which might be why artists never really stopped painting them, even when scientists tried to trap them in charts. There's a charcoal drawing from 1922, done by a quiet Belgian illustrator named Jules Lemaitre. who never published a thing. It was found in a basement years later, untitled, just clouds. But what clouds? You swear you can hear them rustle, feel them shift, like they're breathing through paper. And in the corner of the sketch, he'd written a single phrase: "The sky keeps its own diary." You think about that now as the wind picks up just slightly and the grass whispers at your ankles. Because maybe that's what clouds really are. Not warnings, not decorations, but entries. Lines in a journal written in water and light. Some days are calm, some are spirals. Some forget how to hold their shape entirely. And when you look up, you're reading that sky diary like a nosy neighbor with a telescope. You notice a darker patch overhead now. Could be a nimbostratus, could be a memory. But it makes you wonder if the sky keeps a diary. Does it reread it? Or does it just keep going? Cloud after cloud, moment after moment, never pausing to dwell, never asking, did that shape matter? Only forming, only drifting, only dissolving. And maybe that's a kind of wisdom, because we down here, we tend to clutch things, to archive and obsess, to pin everything down with hashtags and highlight reels. But clouds, they just let go. Even the wildest ones, even the ones no textbook could name. They form, they float, they fade. You breathe in now, deeper than before. Because this section isn't about facts. It's about feel. It's about standing on a ridge at the edge of dusk and thinking, I will never be able to hold the sky, but I can notice it. And that noticing, it's everything. You close your eyes, listen to the hush around you, to the breath of the grass, to the ache in your shoulders softening with the air. You've spent all this time chasing Victorian cloud wars and photographic atlases and weird modern anomalies. But right now, you realize the sky doesn't need us to understand it. It just wants us to look up, to witness, to whisper names into the wind and know they may never stick, but that the act of naming means something anyway. Because whether it's stratus fractus or clouds that look like your grandmother's soup ladle, they mean something to you. And sometimes that's enough. So stand here a minute more. Let the wind wrap around you like the fringe of a blanket. Let the clouds shift above you unbothered, uncategorized, alive, and whisper your own name back to the sky, just once, just to see if it echoes. You don't leave the ridge all at once. You sort of peel away, like dew slipping off a blade of grass. Your boots crunch with that familiar frost-glazed sound part, snow part memory, and the sky has settled into a steady gray, like it's resting after an emotional confession. But the story isn't resting. Not yet. Because tonight, you're walking down from metaphor and mist into the era of old cloud manipulation. That's right. If the Victorians argued about cloud names, the mid-20th century began to argue about what clouds should do, as if the sky was just another appliance that needed better settings. Welcome to We Cloud Seeding. Here's your mainstream historical fact in more. 1940 and small. A chemist named Vincent Schaefer discovered that by introducing dry ice into a cloud, he could make it snow. He was working for General Electric at the time, and his experiment over Mount Greylock in Massachusetts changed how we thought about the weather. Because now we could make it. Sort of. The dream was bold end. Droughts stop hurricanes. Clear skies for military operations make deserts bloom. Sounds noble, right? Sure. But here's the quirky fringe bit by Ruben 1980. The U.S. military had launched something called Project Cirrus and began experimenting with seeding hurricanes. Yes, hurricanes. They thought if they could disrupt the structure early enough, they could tame the storm. Spoiler, it didn't work. Historians still argue whether Project Cirrus made a storm worse, specifically Hurricane King, which shifted unexpectedly and destroyed parts of Georgia after a seeding test. The official line, unrelated. The skies version, probably just one long eye roll. But this period of cloud control dreams wasn't all top secret folders and weather weapons. Some of it was weirdly charming. Picture a bunch of lab-coated scientists standing in frozen fields, shaking salt into clouds like hopeful wizards. hoping for snow, hoping for rain, hoping maybe for relevance. Because as technology advanced, clouds started slipping away from the poets and the painters and into the hands of meteorologists and defense contractors. And something changed. People got nervous. Suddenly the question wasn't, what kind of cloud is that? But who owns it? You read that right. There were diplomatic debates about cloud sovereignty. If country A cedes clouds that rain over country B, who gets the water? Or worse, what if the clouds get seeded and don't rain at all? Imagine trying to sue the sky. There's a 1977 treaty, the NMOD Convention, that bans using weather for hostile military purposes, meaning yes, at some point, enough people worried someone might weaponize fog that they had to write it down. You walk now beneath a thinner stretch of clouds, those high-pearled cirrus threads that look like they've been combed by a giant. And maybe, just maybe, they remember those decades when humans tried to rewrite the atmosphere. Maybe they're still annoyed or amused. Because here's the thing, no scientist could fully control. Clouds are emotional. Not literally, obviously, but culturally, spiritually, absolutely. And cloud seeding proved that. It made people feel hopeful and uneasy in equal measure. It made us dream bigger and doubt more deeply. It blurred the line between weather and willpower. Which brings you to a man named Bernard Vonnegut. Yes, that Vonnegut. Kurt Vonnegut's older brother, a cloud scientist. He discovered that silver iodide could trigger precipitation, that a chemical compound could coax the sky into rain. Kurt wrote novels, Bernard wrote the weather, and you can't help but picture the two of them, one scribbling sci-fi on a typewriter, the other flying into clouds with a case of silver dust, both of them chasing, what-ifs, in entirely different skies. You sit now on a bench beneath a bare-limbed tree. The bark is peeling. The air smells faintly of ozone, and the clouds above you shift from brushed silver to soft pewter like someone's folding a letter across the horizon. And you think, what were we really trying to change? The weather, or our sense of control? Because cloud seeding wasn't just about rain. It was about power, and fear, and longing. It was a kind of skyward therapy, an attempt to fix something larger than ourselves by nudging nature into cooperation. You lean your head back, let the cold air settle in your throat, and for a second, you picture it a whole world where clouds are scheduled, managed, explained. And then, you shake that thought out like snow from your coat. Because deep down, you don't want a predictable sky. You want wonder. You want surprise. You want to wake up and look up and not know what you'll see. Because there's something ancient in that uncertainty. Something beautiful in not being in charge. So tonight, as the wind shifts and the cirrus threads dissolve into a pale blue dusk, you raise an imaginary toast, not to the cloud seeding machines or the classified experiments, but to the mystery that remains, to the part of the sky that still says, not today, not quite, not yet. And you smile, because the forecast still has room for surprise. You stretch your legs as the wind rises again, a polite warning from the trees to brace for one of those long drifting chapters in history, the kind where nothing explodes, but everything changes. You wander now through the pages of the late 1800s and early 1900s, where clouds stopped being just floating metaphors and became diagrams, models, even patents. Because now it's time to talk about the men who claimed to own clouds. Yes. Patent number 312845. Method of producing rainfall. Filed in 1885 by a man named Robert St. George Dyrenforth, a name that sounds like he invented either thunderstorms or dueling etiquette, possibly both. His idea? Explode hydrogen balloons at cloud level and wait for rain. Simple, loud, ineffective. But here's your mainstream historical fact. Between 1880 and 1910, more than a dozen U.S. patents were filed for rainmaking machines. That's not poetic exaggeration. That's in the records. Official ideas for creating artificial downpours by shooting cannons, flying kites, even burning giant trenches of chemicals. Because in that age, progress meant noise, and invention meant spectacle. So if you wanted clouds to rain, You didn't ask politely. You blasted them. This brings us to Charles Hatfield, self-declared rainmaker. A sewing machine salesman by trade, Hatfield promised he could end droughts using a secret chemical formula and a 20-foot tower. The chemical was probably just zinc chloride, maybe ammonium-based solutions, not magic. But Hatfield was good at showmanship. In 1915, the city of San Diego paid him $10,000 to fill a reservoir. He built his tower, released his chemicals, and then it rained. A lot. So much that it caused floods, destroyed bridges, and according to some, killed nearly, not 20 people. Hatfield claimed success. San Diego refused to pay, saying he caused damage, and had no control over what came next. Historians still argue whether Hatfield really made it rain, or just got very, very lucky, or unlucky, or somewhere in between. But the real story, it's not in the weather. It's in the desperation, the hunger for rain in a dry city, the hope that anyone might coax water from the sky. It's myth-making in real time. Hatfield became a legend even if no science backed him. People wanted to believe him, because by then clouds weren't just moisture. They were promises of harvest, of survival, of proof that man could tame the atmosphere, even just for a season. And this trend wasn't limited to cranks and chemists. Even the U.S. Department of Agriculture dabbled in rainmaking with cannon fire in the 1890s, part of a government experiment to determine whether sound could stimulate precipitation. They built towers, fired explosives, carefully documented rainfall. It didn't work, but the reports are beautifully earnest pages filled with diagrams of blast angles, barometric pressure, and proud optimism. Because science back then, it was still partly alchemy, partly theater, and mostly hope. You walk now beneath a mural of that era. In your imagination, gas balloons floating awkwardly among cumulus stacks. Men in waistcoats with binoculars, diagrams scrawled on chalkboards beside cracked jars of chemical ambition. And in the middle of it all, the clouds, still drifting, still ignoring us, still doing what they want when they want. There's something comforting in that. Because for all the pomp, the patents, and the powder kegs, nature kept her pace. Sometimes raining, sometimes not, but always, always watching. You take a deep breath. There's wood smoke in the air again. Maybe someone nearby is roasting chestnuts, or maybe your imagination has returned to the Ottoman kitchens from earlier in the series. You smile, because even now in the age of rockets and radar, you know this, we still don't really understand the sky. Not fully. We measure it. We model it. We launch balloons and satellites and say cumulonimbus like we invented it. But when the storm rolls in, when the wind bends trees and thunder hums across rooftops, we still stop what we're doing and watch. Not because we're scared, but because we're humbled. The Victorians tried to name the sky. Their sons tried to control it. Their grandsons tried to king sell it. But clouds don't care. They float on. They swell and dissolve and glide. And tonight, as you stand in a field that never asked for names or patents, you do the same. You watch the wind move west. You watch the high clouds fade to violet. You press your hands into your coat pockets and feel the paper from earlier, the quote you were given. Winter is not the enemy, forgetting is. And you understand that this whole tale, this winding, storm-chasing, name-chiseling, myth-busting saga, has never been about meteorology. It's about memory, about trying to mark the ephemeral, to hold on to something that was never meant to be held. You smile, because that's very human of us, and very beautiful. And you keep walking. You keep walking, and the air feels different now. Lighter. The sky's cleared above you, stars freckling the darkness like scattered sugar over slate. The wind has softened into something almost melodic, brushing past your collar like a sigh from the 19th century itself. You're not walking into history anymore, you're walking out of it, trailing wisps of cloud names and ghosted patent diagrams behind you, like coattails in the breeze. And what a century it was, right? So much fuss over vapor, so many arguments about shapes you can't even touch. But it didn't end with the Victorians. Not even close. You drift now into the 20th century, where cloud watching becomes less of a hobby for poets and more of a battleground for precision and progress. You find yourself peering into the world of World War II, where clouds became military data. Pilots had to learn what kind of cloud would hide a bomber best, which formation meant turbulence, which meant rain, and which might save your life if you ducked behind it fast enough. A cumulus good cover. Stratus predictable. Cirrus useless. Beautiful, but useless. So the military got involved. Meteorology was militarized. And here's your mainstream historical fact. By 1944, both the Allies and Axis powers had entire weather divisions, decoding the sky hour by hour, preparing forecasts that could change the outcome of entire battles. D-Day, yeah. The timing hinged on a well-precise forecast. Cloud cover over Normandy had to be just right. It nearly wasn't. A single misjudged cloud layer could mean disaster, so cloud knowledge became a kind of armor. But here's the quirky part, despite all that money and manpower. Soldiers still wrote home complaining about the weather. Turns out even tactical meteorology couldn't stop drizzle from soaking your socks. And now you're in the post-war era. Clouds begin to be photographed from above. Spy planes, weather balloons, satellites. The cloud atlas, once sketched by hand in the margin of a journal, becomes a global archive, digitized, categorized, ready for coders and climatologists to plug into giant machines. You sip tea? Yes, there's tea in your hand now because you're cozy, and we're in the final act, and watch as cloud seeding arrives on the scene. Silver iodide. Planes flying into cloud banks and releasing particles that allegedly encourage precipitation. It sounds like magic, or science fiction, or a Bond villain's pet project. And yet it's real. It started in the 1940s and kept going. They still do it today. China seeded clouds before the 2008 Olympics. Dubai does it every summer. Even the U.S. Department of Defense has filed documents, some redacted, on weather modification experiments. Which brings us to our scholarly debate of the hour. Historians still argue whether cloud seeding ever worked consistently at all, or whether it's just another expensive ritual we perform to feel like we're in charge of the atmosphere. You know where you stand, though. You've spent this entire journey with your feet in the mud and your head in the clouds. You've watched poets call mist sky milk, and generals call it visual interference. You've watched balloonists try to name the sky, and bureaucrats try to monetize it. And through it all, the clouds never asked for any of it. They just were, drifting, melting, reforming, mischievous little metaphors that refused to hold still. And that's the magic of clouds, isn't it? They are unsavable. You can't collect one. You can't fence one in. You can name it, but only for a moment. Only until it changes, which it always does. And yet we keep trying. We write poems. We sketch diagrams. We argue in velvet-trimmed lecture halls about whether that's an altocumulus lenticularis or just a particularly motivated cumulus mediocris. We invent instruments. We start societies. We fly planes through thunderheads and snap photos of mare's tails at golden hour, all because of a wisp of water vapor and light. You sip your tea again. It tastes like chamomile with maybe a trace of bergamot and a memory of lemon. Or maybe you're imagining that, because imagination is all over this topic. Clouds are emotion in the sky. They tell you how the air feels, how the temperature has shifted. They give you metaphors when you're sad and shade when you're hot, and something to stare at when you're trying not to cry in public. They're useful, yes, but also tender, softness you can see, movement you can't touch, a weather report wrapped in poetry. You lie back now in this imagined field beneath a very real night sky. No storm, no patents, just breath and breeze and a few wisps overhead that glow faintly silver. Maybe cirrostratus, maybe nothing, maybe just the past curling around the edges of your present. And you understand something deep now, something that wasn't in any textbook, that when Victorian scientists argued about cloud shapes, they weren't just arguing about science. They were arguing about control. about what it meant to live in a world that was always changing, about whether you could name impermanence. And that, my friend, that's still something we do. Every day, you close your eyes, feel the rhythm of your breath, let the last word of the section melt like mist on your cheek. You rest now, belly full of knowledge, head humming gently with Latin names and weather charts. But there's still a final thread to follow, just one more strand of cirrus to chase before the sky turns black and the night closes completely around you. Because this story ends not in a laboratory or lecture hall. It ends in your own neck-craned gaze, the one you tilt upward without thinking whenever you walk outside and notice the lights shifted. And it turns out that impulse, that very human, slightly wistful compulsion to look up at clouds, it didn't stop after the Victorians lost interest or the satellites took over. In fact, in 2006, a new kind of rebellion drifted in. A man named Gavin Preter-Pinney, graphic designer, part philosopher, part troublemaker, founded something called the Cloud Appreciation Society in Somerset, England. Its motto, look up marvel at the ephemeral beauty and live life with your head in the clouds. Yes, that's real. No, you can't make it up. What started as a cheeky manifesto turned into a worldwide movement. Tens of thousands of members. Cloud spotters, dreamers, retired pilots, bored accountants, 9-year-olds who drew thunderheads in their math books. They weren't looking to predict storms. They were looking to feel something, to remember what the Victorians tried so hard to label and what the rest of us tried so hard to monetize. The awe. That's your final mainstream historical fact. In 2017, thanks in part to pressure from the Cloud Appreciation Society, the World Meteorological Organization officially recognized a new cloud type in its Atlas Asperitas. Rolling chaotic like an upside-down ocean, photographed first by amateurs, named by artists, accepted finally by the official skykeepers, which brings us to your final quirky moment. In that same year, a man in New Zealand submitted a cloud photo he thought resembled a dragon giving birth to a goose. It won 3rd place in the Society's photo contest. He framed the certificate, hung it in his hallway, and here's your scholarly debate to close it out. Historians still argue whether amateur observations like these democratize science or muddy it. Some say letting non-professionals name clouds is silly. Others say it's the whole point, that the sky doesn't belong to meteorologists. It belongs to everyone. You sip whatever drink is left in your hand. Maybe it's tea, maybe it's boza, maybe it's warm air disguised as memory, and you nod. Because yes, that's it. This story of clouds is yours. It belongs to the bored sailor from 1802 sketching vapor trails in the margin of a logbook, to the schoolgirl in 1887 who compared cirrus to lace and wasn't wrong, to the Victorian scholars who named the sky like they were writing love letters in Latin, to the Batuku pilots scanning for cover, to the Cold War bureaucrats trying to seed rain, to the kids playing Name That Cloud while lying on warm grass in July, to you, right now, lying back in this moment, breath-soft limbs, heavy eyes drifting. Clouds don't last. They shift. They vanish. They return. But the words we gave them, they echo. So maybe that's the real power of those old arguments. Those Victorian voices rattling around in libraries and memoirs and misfiled patents. They weren't trying to tame the sky. They were trying to remember it, to hold it somehow, to say, I saw this. It mattered. And now you've seen it too. You let your breath stretch long now. You feel the soft weight of the blanket, the hush in the room, the warmth coiled behind your ribs like a finished story curling up to rest. You made it, through the fog banks of history, the drizzle of data, the occasional thunderclap of absurdity. And now the sky has cleared. For you. Because bedtime history isn't just about the facts. It's about feeling them settle. Like mist on cobblestones. Like dew in a cloud atlas no one will ever finish. You close your eyes now. and dream not of answers, but of shapes. And now the wind stills. Let it. Let the ideas soften into vapor. Let your body settle into that gentle suspension between thought and sleep. You've wandered through centuries tonight, followed poets and pilots, scientists and sky watchers, all of them chasing something you can't fold into a jar or trap in a slide rule. You can only witness it, name it, and let it pass. Like a good story, like a drifting cloud. So let your breath slow now. Let it match the rhythm of something older than clocks. You are warm. You are safe. You are held not by arms, but by the knowledge that some people once looked up at the sky and felt the same way you do right now, small, quiet, wondering, and still. Enough. Let the names of clouds blur together. Let the Latin melt into lullaby. Let the last image fade, a dark sky painted in streaks of silver with one soft curl of cirrus trailing behind like the final line in a poem you'll never need to explain. You don't have to remember it all. You just have to feel it and carry that feeling with you as you drift deeper. Because here tonight, even the arguments of Victorian scientists are just bedtime stories in disguise. Soft, strange, and sweet. Sleep well, cloud watcher. The sky's still there. And it remembers you too. Thank you for joining us on this journey today. Maybe by now you've already drifted off to sleep, and if so, we hope this story brought you peace of mind and helped you rest a little easier. Deep sleep makes life better, and we're truly happy to be part of that. Until next time, sweet dreams.